The document was 1 page long, and it had been sitting in a decommissioned federal archive for decades before anyone noticed what it actually said. 1 page, and buried in the middle of it, between 2 paragraphs of completely standard land survey language, was a single sentence that described interior formations of non-natural origin inside a canyon drainage in the inland Mountain West. Just that. One sentence. And then the very next sentence said the opposite. It walked the whole thing back in the same breath, the same paragraph, the same clinical government tone, as if someone had caught the first sentence halfway out the door and yanked it back inside. That contradiction, those two sentences sitting right next to each other like nothing had happened, that was the thing that stopped David cold. David had been working through digitized Federal Archive material for a long time. Long enough to know the difference between a sloppy report and a corrected one. This was not sloppy. The language around those two sentences was precise, careful, exactly the kind of dry, bureaucratic writing that takes effort to produce. Someone had written the first sentence, understood what it meant, and then written the second sentence to neutralize it, not delete it, neutralize it, which meant the original sentence had already been filed, already been seen by someone further up the chain, and the solution chosen was not erasure, but contradiction. Leave the evidence in place. Just make sure the sentence right next to it tells the reader not to believe it. He printed the page, he put it on his desk, and looked at it for a while. Then he started pulling on the thread that sentence was attached to. The report referenced a specific canyon, no name, just a grid reference and a note about drainage patterns in the inland Mountain West. He cross-referenced the grid coordinates with current public land maps. And that was the second moment that made the back of his neck go cold. The location existed. The canyon was real. But on every current public land map he could find, that specific section of terrain carried no designation at all, not restricted, not protected, not flagged in any category, just absent. A blank space where a place should be, sitting there quietly, like it had always been nothing, like no one had ever needed to decide what it was. You do not leave a blank space by accident. Blank spaces in land records are decisions. They are the administrative equivalent of a hand placed flat over a name. Someone, at some point, had looked at that canyon and chosen not to label it, and that choice had been renewed, quietly, through every subsequent map revision, every database update, every digital migration of the official record. The absence had been maintained, actively, for a very long time. David sat with that for a moment and then wrote 3 words in his notebook. Not a question, just 3 words. Then he started making calls. If you want to understand what he found when he followed those coordinates, stay with me, because what comes next is the part that changes everything. And if this kind of story matters to you, please subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps this reach the people who need to hear it. Thomas was not the kind of man who exaggerated. That is the first thing you need to understand about him, because everything that follows depends on it. He was a surveyor's assistant working a private mineral assessment contract in Canyon Country, hired to measure rock strata and log drainage patterns, the least glamorous work in the world. His field notebooks, the ones that still exist, are almost comically precise. Measurements to the nearest quarter inch, weather noted twice daily, sketches that look less like art and more like engineering diagrams. This was not a man who added color to his observations. He wrote what he saw, and he moved on. He was working along the lower canyon wall on an ordinary morning when the river undercut gave way. Not a violent collapse, more like the hillside exhaled. A section of the cliff face, maybe 40 feet wide, separated from itself and came down in a slow, grinding slide that filled the air with the smell of broken rock and cold, wet earth. Thomas stepped back, waited for the dust to thin, and then did what surveyors do. He walked over to look at what the ground had given up. What he saw stopped him at the edge of the debris field, 3 openings in the newly exposed rock face, rectangular, flat-floored. right-angled at every corner in a way that the surrounding natural stone, rough and irregular and completely indifferent to geometry, simply did not suggest was possible. The ceilings ran somewhere around 15 feet overhead. He wrote that number twice in his notebook, once in the field entry and once in the margin beside it, as if he needed to confirm it to himself. The walls inside were smooth, not polished exactly, but worked, shaped by something that understood the difference between a surface and a slab, and across those walls, running in horizontal rows from somewhere in the darkness at the back of the chamber to the lit edge near the opening, were marks. Geometric, repeating, organized with a regularity that made the skin on his arms tighten in a way he did not have good language for. He sketched what he could. He measured the opening of the first chamber. He wrote his observations in the same flat, precise tone he used for rock strata and water depth. But if you read the entry carefully, and David read it many times, you notice something in the handwriting itself. The letters get slightly larger toward the bottom of the page. The pressure on the pencil increases. Thomas was not a man who exaggerated, but something in that canyon was making it very hard for him to stay level. He submitted the notebook to his employer the following week as part of his standard contract deliverables. It was logged as received, and then it was never returned to him. Cole had arrived in the area 3 days before the cliff face came down. Not after. Before. David found that detail buried in a boarding house register from a small settlement near the canyon, a handwritten ledger that had ended up in a regional historical collection almost by accident, donated along with a box of unrelated estate papers by someone who had no idea what they were giving away. The register listed a guest by the surname Cole, no first name given, occupation listed as geological consultant, length of stay open-ended. 3 days before the collapse. In a settlement that had almost no reason to attract a geological consultant at that particular time, in that particular season, near that particular canyon. David stared at that ledger entry for a long time. He thought about Thomas, precise and careful Thomas, submitting his field notebook and never seeing it again. He thought about the blank space on the map. And then he thought about what it means when someone arrives at a location just before the ground opens up and reveals something that was never supposed to be found. Cole was at the site within hours of the collapse. Thomas confirmed this in a letter he wrote to a former colleague some months after the event, a letter that David found in a private collection after a long search. Thomas described a man appearing at the canyon entrance in the late afternoon, well dressed in a way that felt out of place against the raw, broken landscape, carrying a leather case and moving through the debris field with a confidence that suggested he was not seeing it for the first time. Thomas had assumed he was another contractor. He had no reason to think otherwise. Cole introduced himself briefly, gave no employer, asked 2 or 3 questions about the chamber dimensions in a tone that was professional and completely flat, and then walked inside. What happened next is the part Thomas clearly struggled to describe. Cole crouched near the far wall of the first chamber in the area where the geometric markings were densest and picked something up from the floor. Thomas had not noticed it before, which bothered him because Thomas noticed everything. It was flat, roughly the size of a hand, and when Cole turned it toward the light coming through the chamber opening, it caught that light in a way that neither stone nor wood nor any material Thomas had encountered in years of fieldwork would catch it. Not reflective like metal. Different from that. Deeper somehow, like the light was going into it rather than bouncing off it. Thomas wrote that looking at it made him feel briefly dizzy, which he immediately followed with a note clarifying that he had not slept well the previous 2 nights, as if he needed to provide an explanation for his own reaction. Cole put the object into his leather case, closed it, and left the canyon before sunset. He said almost nothing on the way out. Thomas asked him where he was based, and Cole gave the name of a city 3 states away and kept walking. That was the last time Thomas saw him. When Thomas returned to the boarding house that evening, the register showed Cole had already checked out. Gone. No forwarding information. No record of where he went. David spent weeks trying to trace Cole through every directory, employment record, and professional registry he could access. Nothing. Not a trace. A man with a profession, a name, and a leather case full of something extraordinary, and the historical record had simply closed around him like water closing over a stone. The thing about that object, the thing David kept coming back to, was not what it was. It was the fact that Cole knew exactly where to look for it. He walked into a chamber that had been sealed inside a mountain for an unknown length of time, in an area with no obvious reason for a geological consultant to be present. 3 days before, the ground happened to open up and expose it, and he walked straight to the spot on the floor where the one inexplicable object was sitting. David wrote 4 question marks in his notebook after that realization, and then sat very still for a while. Now here is where the story shifts, because Cole and his leather case and whatever was inside it are one thread. But the canyon itself, the reason it was there at all, the reason it was built at the scale it was built, that is a completely different and much older thread. And to follow that one, you have to understand what this land was before anyone with a ledger or a map or a government contract ever laid eyes on it. The canyon region existed in a kind of administrative silence before the land classification era arrived. Not wilderness in the romantic sense, not empty, but unmeasured, unallocated, sitting in the gap between what the official record had gotten to and what it had not yet reached. There was a specific window, maybe 2 or 3 decades, when that territory could still give up its secrets without an institutional apparatus already in place to catch them and make them disappear. The collapse that exposed the chambers happened inside that window. Barely inside it. Another decade, and the infrastructure of control would have been dense enough that a discovery of that scale would never have left the canyon in any form that anyone outside a locked filing cabinet would ever see. Private mineral interests had been mapping the canyon drainage for years before the official surveys arrived. The men behind those interests understood the territory's value in very specific terms. There was extractable material in the rock strata, the kind that made the long journey into that country financially worthwhile. And those men had connections, quiet and well-maintained connections, to the early land classification process that would determine what the canyon officially was and what could legally be done with it. They were not waiting for the official surveys. They were shaping what the official surveys would find. And a major discovery inside that canyon, the kind that would draw attention from universities and scientific institutions and the press, was exactly the kind of complication they had spent years learning how to prevent. The machinery was not built in response to Thomas and Cole and the chambers. It was already running. What David was only beginning to understand was just how long it had been running and how far back the tracks actually went. The discovery in that canyon was not the first one. That is the thing that hit David like a wall when he finally found the earlier survey records. Not the first, not even close. A generation before Thomas ever set foot near that cliff face, a government-contracted field team had worked the same drainage and come back with findings that should have changed everything. Should have. The lead surveyor on that earlier team, a man named Robert Marsh, had submitted internal reports describing what he called structural anomalies inconsistent with natural formation processes. Not cave systems, not erosion patterns, structural anomalies. Those 2 words sitting in a 100-year-old document felt like finding a live wire in a wall you thought was dead. David pulled every related document he could find from that earlier survey period. What he found was a sequence that made the hair on his arms stand up. Marsh had submitted his initial field report through standard channels. It was logged, acknowledged, and internally circulated to 3 senior officials. Then Marsh submitted a formal request for a follow-up investigation, citing the scale of what his team had documented and the need for proper assessment. That request was also logged and acknowledged. And then nothing happened. No follow-up team was sent. No additional resources were allocated. The request sat in the system like a stone dropped into deep water, and the ripples just stopped. What made it worse was the timing. Marsh submitted his follow-up request in the spring. By the following autumn, his name had disappeared from every subsequent government contract list. No termination record, no resignation letter, no forwarding address in any directory David could find. One season, he was a working surveyor with an active government contract and a documented discovery that demanded attention. The next season, he was simply gone from the record, as completely and cleanly as if someone had waited for the ink to dry on his request and then quietly closed the door behind him. David sat with that for a long time, because what Marsh's disappearance told him was not just that the suppression had happened before. It told him that the people running it had already worked out the method. They did not need to destroy Marsh or threaten him or make anything dramatic happen. They just needed to make him professionally invisible. No contracts meant no access. No access meant no further documentation. And without further documentation, Marsh's anomalies would sit in an internal file that nobody outside the chain would ever request, because nobody outside the chain would know it existed. The system did not silence Marsh by stopping his mouth. It silenced him by removing every platform he had to speak from. And it had done exactly the same thing to Thomas, one generation later, with the same quiet efficiency. Same method, different name. The canyon had been protected twice now, and David was only beginning to understand how many times that number might actually be. Now comes the part that made David's hands go cold when he read it. Because after weeks of following Marsh and the earlier survey records and the pattern of professional erasure, he found something in a secondary archive that reframed the entire timeline. A handwritten note, not an official document, just a note clipped to the inside cover of a survey ledger from the period before Marsh, before Thomas, before anyone with a government contract had come near the canyon at all. The note was unsigned. It was brief. It said only that the drainage area had been previously assessed and that certain findings had been referred to a separate documentation process. Referred to a separate documentation process. David read that phrase 4 times, because there was no separate documentation process in any public record. None. Which meant either the process did not exist, or it existed somewhere that the public record was never going to show him. Within a year of Thomas submitting his notebook, a federal agency issued a formal assessment of the canyon area. David found it in a bound volume of regional land reports, tucked between 2 assessments of completely unrelated territories, as if someone had been hoping the filing order would do part of the work. The assessment was 3 sentences long, 3 sentences to cover a canyon that contained carved chambers with 15-foot ceilings and walls covered in geometric markings. The first sentence described the terrain type. The second sentence attributed the rock face formations to water erosion and natural seismic activity. The third sentence stated that no findings of cultural or historical significance had been identified. No photographs. No measurements, no field agent named, no methodology described. Just 3 sentences and an official seal, sitting there in the bound volume with the calm authority of something that had never needed to justify itself to anyone. David checked the agency's own internal travel records for the period covered by the assessment. He had access to a partial set through a research request that had taken months to process. And what those travel records showed was that no field agent had been logged as traveling to the canyon region during the window when the assessment claimed to have been conducted. The assessment existed. The inspection that produced it apparently did not. Someone had written 3 sentences about finding nothing in a place they had never visited, filed it under an official seal, and sent it into the permanent record as the authoritative account of what was in that canyon. Think about what that actually means. It means the official version of reality for that location was not based on observation. It was written first, and the observation was simply never made, because the observation was not the point. The point was the document. The point was having something in the record that future agencies could cite when they needed to justify keeping the canyon classified, something they could point to and say the matter has already been assessed and found unremarkable. The assessment was not a conclusion reached by investigation. It was a placeholder inserted to prevent investigation from ever being necessary again. And it worked. For a very long time, it worked perfectly. What David did not yet know was who had given the order to write it and what that person had been so determined to protect. The man who ordered that 3-sentence report had a name, and finding it took David the better part of 3 months. His name was Harlan, not a government official, not a surveyor, not anyone whose name appeared in the public-facing record of land assessment or federal agency work. Harlan was a private infrastructure investor with financial stakes in the extraction corridor that ran directly through the canyon territory, and his connection to the official classification process was not documented in any single place. It was distributed across dozens of small pieces of correspondence, land allocation requests, and meeting records spread across multiple collections in multiple archives, each piece individually meaningless, collectively devastating. David built it the way you build a picture out of fragments. A letter here in which Harlan writes to a regional official about the importance of maintaining what he calls a clear developmental pathway through the canyon drainage. A memo there showing Harlan's legal representative present at a land classification meeting where the canyon's status was being determined. A note in a contractor's ledger showing payment to a survey firm that employed, as a senior consultant, the same unnamed field agent category referenced in the 3-sentence assessment. None of it was a smoking document. All of it pointed in exactly one direction. What made Harlan so effective was that he never needed to say the obvious thing out loud. He did not write letters ordering anyone to suppress anything. He wrote letters about developmental pathways and classification timelines and the business climate for extraction investment. He spoke the language of logistics, and the people around him understood perfectly well what the logistics required. A major discovery in the canyon would trigger federal oversight. Federal oversight would delay the classification process. A delayed classification process would push back the extraction timeline by years and cost Harlan and his partners an amount of money that made the cost of a quiet assessment report look like rounding error. The math was not complicated, and everyone in the room knew how to do it. This is the thing about that kind of arrangement that David kept trying to explain to people who found it hard to believe. It does not require anyone to be a villain in the way we imagine villains. It does not require a dramatic meeting in a dark room where someone says the forbidden thing and everyone agrees to do the wrong thing. It requires only that a group of people share an economic interest in a particular outcome and that the system around them is flexible enough to accommodate that interest without anyone having to formally acknowledge what they are doing. Harlan did not destroy the canyon discovery. He just made sure the official paperwork described something that would not slow down his investment schedule. And the system produced that paperwork because the system had been built by people like Harlan and ran on priorities like his. The cover-up was not a crime committed against the system. It was the system working exactly as designed. David found one more thing in Harlan's correspondence that he could not stop thinking about. In a letter written to a business associate around the time the 3-sentence assessment was filed, Harlan made a passing reference to having resolved the canyon matter and moved on immediately to discussing extraction equipment costs. The canyon matter, that was all. No description of what the matter was. No reference to chambers or geometric markings or a surveyor named Thomas who had measured 15-foot ceilings in carved stone. Just the canyon matter, resolved, filed away in the same sentence as a line item about machinery. Whatever had been found in that rock face, whatever Thomas had sketched and Cole had quietly removed a piece of, it had registered in Harlan's mind as a logistical obstacle that had been handled. And then he had gone back to his spreadsheets. A librarian named Sarah sent David a message on a Tuesday afternoon, and the subject line was 4 words long. It said, "I think I found something." David had put out a general research request months earlier through a network of independent historians and archivists who occasionally helped him track down primary sources. Most of those requests produced nothing. This one produced Margaret. Margaret had kept a diary across more than a decade, a detailed, dated, precisely written record of her daily life as the wife of a local physician working in a settlement near the Canyon region. Her granddaughter had kept the diary after Margaret's passing and eventually passed it to Sarah's family, where it had sat in a storage box for years before Sarah, who worked at a small regional library, had started cataloging it as part of a private family history project. Sarah had not been looking for anything related to the canyon. She had simply been reading, and then she had turned to an entry from several weeks after Thomas's field notebook was submitted, and she had stopped breathing for a moment. Margaret wrote in that entry that her husband had been called to treat 2 men who had returned from the Southern Canyon country in a state she described as unlike anything she had seen him deal with before. Not sick, not physically hurt, shaken in a way that went deeper than anything the body does on its own. Her husband had told her that the men could not sit still, that they kept checking the windows, that one of them, a man Margaret identified only by the surname Cole, had refused to answer any questions about what they had seen inside the canyon and had asked her husband twice whether anyone else had been told about the visit. Cole, the same surname that appeared in the boarding house register 3 days before the collapse, the same Cole who had walked into the canyon with a leather case and walked out with something inside it that caught light in a way Thomas had never seen before. Here he was again, weeks later, sitting in a physician's office in a settlement near the canyon, shaking, checking the windows, asking whether anyone had been told. David read that diary entry 4 times. Then he wrote Sarah back and asked if the diary had ever been formally cataloged at a historical institution. Sarah's reply came the next morning. She had tried, she said. She had contacted a regional historical archive and offered to donate the diary for proper preservation and public access. The archive had responded that they had no current capacity for new acquisitions and suggested she try again at a later date. She had tried again 6 months later and received the same response. The diary was real. The corroboration was real. And somewhere between Margaret's careful handwriting and the public record, a door had been quietly closed. David had documented 35 cases before the canyon, 35 separate discoveries, different regions, different decades, different types of physical evidence, and every single one followed the same sequence so precisely that by the time he reached case 20, he had stopped being surprised and started being nauseated. Local discovery, informal documentation, institutional acquisition, official reclassification, access restriction, administrative silence. The rhythm of it was almost mechanical. Like watching the same lock turn on 35 different doors. But the canyon case was different from the others in one specific way that kept pulling at him. In most of the 35 cases, the physical scale of what was found was large but explainable within a range that the official record could stretch to accommodate. Unusual stonework, oversized structural elements, geometric markings that could be reclassified as decorative rather than functional. The official framework had learned to absorb those findings by making them slightly smaller in the retelling. But the canyon chambers, with their 15-foot ceilings and their 3 rectangular openings and their walls covered in organized horizontal registers of geometric marks, were not slightly unusual. They were built at a scale that the official framework had no category for at all. And that, David realized, was precisely why the suppression around this particular site had been so much more aggressive than the others. He laid out every case in a single document and looked at them together for the first time. What he saw was not just a pattern of suppression. It was a pattern of escalating suppression. The more architecturally significant the discovery, the faster and more thorough the institutional response. Small anomalies got the slow treatment, reclassification over years, quiet access restrictions, the gradual administrative fade. Large anomalies got something faster and more deliberate. The Canyon had gotten the fastest response of anything in his 35 cases. The 3-sentence assessment filed before anyone had physically visited the site. The land classification locked down within months. Harlan's letter describing the matter as resolved before the ink on the assessment was dry. Someone had moved with unusual speed on this one, and speed of that kind only comes from urgency, and urgency only comes from fear. What were they afraid of? David spent a long time sitting with that question in the particular way you sit with a question when you know the answer is going to be uncomfortable. The chambers were not built for people of ordinary size. The ceilings were 15 feet high. The doorways were proportioned for occupants considerably larger than anything in the accepted record of human habitation on this continent. And the geometric markings on the walls were organized with the regularity of a written system, not scattered decoration, not ceremonial imagery, but something that carried the structural logic of language. What the official record could not afford to acknowledge was not just that something had been built there. It was what the existence of that building implied about who had built it, and what had happened to them, and why the land above their chambers had been empty and unmapped when the first surveyors arrived. The diary was the piece that broke something open in David in a way that none of the documentary evidence had quite managed. Because Margaret had not been a researcher. She had not been trying to document anything larger than the daily life of her household. She had simply been a careful observer writing down what her husband told her at the end of his working day. And what her husband had told her on that particular evening was that Cole had been shaking and checking the windows and asking whether anyone else had been told. That detail, Cole checking the windows, landed differently than any document David had found. Documents could be written to serve a purpose. Margaret had no purpose. She was just writing down what she saw, and what she saw was a man who had been inside those chambers and come out changed in a way that a physician who dealt with physical injury every day did not have a category for. David thought about Thomas too, about the way the handwriting in his field notebook got larger and the pencil pressure increased toward the bottom of that entry. 2 men who had been inside the same space, weeks apart, both carrying something out with them that their bodies could not quite put down afterward. Whatever was in those chambers, whatever was written on those walls, whatever that object was that caught the light in a way neither stone nor wood nor any familiar material would catch it, it had left a mark on both of them that went deeper than memory. The canyon is still classified. That is where this story ends, not with a revelation, not with a dramatic uncovering, but with a classification status renewed through successive administrative reviews, each one citing the previous review as its justification, forming a loop so self-contained that it requires no new inspection, no new evidence, no new decision by any living person. The restriction is maintained by its own momentum, the way a heavy door stays shut not because anyone is holding it, but because the weight of it is enough on its own. David made a formal research access request for the canyon site. It took 4 months to receive a response. The response cited the existing classification, referenced the original assessment, and noted that no new review was currently scheduled. He filed an appeal. The appeal was acknowledged. Months passed. A follow-up inquiry returned a form letter explaining that the review process for restricted land classifications operated on a multi-year cycle and that his request had been added to the queue. He checked the queue status periodically for a long time after that. It never moved. Thomas's sketches are gone. The notebook he submitted to his employer was never returned to him and does not appear in any collection David has been able to locate. Cole's leather case and whatever was inside it went somewhere that the historical record has chosen not to show. Marsh's follow-up request for investigation sits in an archive as a document that was received, logged, and never acted on. And Margaret's diary, the one piece of evidence that gives the whole story a human pulse, sits in a storage box in Sarah's family home, uncatalogued, unprotected, known to almost nobody. But the chambers are still there. That is the thing that David kept coming back to at the end of all of it. The suppression did not destroy what Thomas walked into. It did not fill the chambers with concrete or collapse the canyon walls back over the openings. It simply built a wall of paperwork in front of the physical wall of stone and trusted that the paperwork would be obstacle enough. The geometric markings are still on those walls in the dark. The proportions of those doorways are still carved into the rock at whatever scale they were cut to. The answer to what was built there, and by whom, and what happened to them, is still sitting in the same mountain it has always been in, patient in the way that stone is patient, waiting in the way that truth waits when it has nowhere else to go. The real question is not whether the suppression succeeded. It clearly did for a very long time. And in most of the 35 cases, it will probably continue to succeed indefinitely. The real question is what it cost. Not financially, not politically, but in terms of what we understand about this world and who built it before we arrived with our maps and our classification systems and our 3-sentence assessments of places we never visited. Every door that gets locked behind a wall of administrative paperwork is a question that never gets asked. And the questions we never ask are the ones that shape the limits of everything we think we know. Here is what I want to ask you directly. If you had been Thomas, standing at the edge of that debris field, looking at 3 rectangular openings carved into a mountain at a scale that made no sense under any official framework you had ever been given, knowing that submitting your notebook meant it would disappear into a system designed to make it disappear, would you have submitted it, or would you have done something different? Tell me in the comments because I think your answer says something important about the moment we are all in right now. If this story reached you the way it reached me when I first put these pieces together, please leave a like and subscribe. It is the only way this kind of work finds the people who need to hear it.